Hey everybody, it's great to be with you this morning. As Gwen and Reynolds said, my name is Burke and I work here with the VS Code team. And if I've not met you before via YouTube or TikTok, it's great to meet you today. We are so glad that you're here. And what we're gonna do for the next 45 minutes or so is go behind the scenes and give you some of the untold stories behind some of the biggest features that you may know or may not know about in Visual Studio Code. But before we do that, I want to ask you to, if you will, cast your mind back. The year is 1968. And this gentleman, whose name is Spencer Silver, in this very 1960s kitchen here, is working at a company called 3M. And he's working on a project. And the project that he's working on is developing an adhesive that's strong enough to be used in aircraft construction. Okay, so it has to be really strong. And what he develops is something that's called acrylic copolymer microspheres. And what this really is just thousands and thousands of these tiny acrylic spheres which form an adhesive surface. The problem with this invention of his is that it isn't very strong. In fact, it isn't strong enough for aircraft construction, but it isn't strong enough for anything. Literally can't be used for anything. And so that project actually fails in that regard. Fast forward about 6 years, and this gentleman, this is Arthur Fry, he's also working at 3M, and he attends a lunch and learn or a seminar where none other than Spencer Silver is talking about acrylic copolymer microspheres. 6 years later, he's still talking about it. And Spencer Silver is sitting there thinking about these acrylic copolymer microspheres, which are kind of sticky, but not really. And he thinks that his bookmark is always falling out of his hymnal in church when he's singing. And maybe he could use this to keep the bookmark stuck to the page, and that when he pulled it off, that it wouldn't damage the page. And so he goes back to the lab and he actually builds this. He makes this bookmark and makes sure that it doesn't leave a residue on the page as well. And you probably have used Arthur's bookmarks, because together Spencer Silver and Arthur Fry created the Post-it note. Every feature of every product that we use has a story like this behind it. There's some chance order of events and people and places and things that deliver us the things that we know and use every single day. So today, what I want to do is take you behind the scenes with Visual Studio Code and give you the Post-it note stories from some of the biggest features from the past year. Now, when I was preparing for this keynote, I really struggled with what should we cover in this keynote, which features. VS Code releases 11 times per year, every month, pretty much with a gap in December. Now, each of these releases has new features that have been carefully thought through, every single one, to make you more productive and to make it easier for you to build things and be delighted by what you build. We're very careful about that, and we take that very seriously. So even the smallest features have a lot of thought behind them. Everything has been carefully considered and has an interesting origin story, even if you've never heard of it or it shows up in a footnote in the release notes. So I went back to last year and I looked at all of last year plus up to where we are now. So this is just last year. These are the release highlights from last year. Did I get it? We're having technical difficulties. We just removed something. I can't multitask, y'all. I'm doing the best I can here. So if each of these releases is a newspaper here, that what you see, these are just sort of like the headlines on the front page, right? There's an entire newspaper behind each one of these releases. And in fact, there's so much in each release that one of the biggest challenges that we have here on the team is making sure that you know about it. And that's a big part of what myself and Gwen and Reynolds do here on this team, is create the content to help you know that the features are there. And so we're familiar with a lot of these features, but even we don't know the stories behind them. We're kind of like you. We see them when they come out in release notes. And because features show up as these release notes here, they look kind of clinical, right? So this is how they show up in your editor. You may see them on the web. You may have never seen them, be like, I don't know what a release note is. That's totally fine. It's not the most exciting read, okay? We try and make these as concise as possible. We use videos and GIFs, and we take the features and we try to describe them in 1 or 2 sentences in a video. And then what happens then is that each feature, no matter how long it's been worked on, kind of gets boiled down to basically like an H2, a paragraph, and a GIF at the most. All of the other context is left out. By the way, the theme that I'll be using throughout this presentation is Cobalt 2 from our friend Wes Boss. Shout out to Wes. Beautiful theme. Y'all should check that out. And since we realize that not everyone reads the release notes, we accept that this is the truth. We also post these short videos every month on both TikTok and YouTube, where we take the highlights from the highlights. This is stuff we feel like is essential for you to know, and we post these in 60-second or less videos. And this is the best way to stay up to date with pretty much everything that's going on in Visual Studio Code. So what you can do is just follow on YouTube or TikTok or subscribe, and you can just kind of set it and forget it, and you'll always know. You don't have to wonder, you will always know. And this is true for keeping up with what's new in AI for VS Code as well. So in this context, we're actually boiling things down even further, right? The attention economy is brutal, y'all, let me tell you. And so one of the other things that we do is we hold these things called release parties once a month. And in these release parties, we highlight a couple of these features and we sort of dive deep into them and bring on the engineers who've worked on these features. And when these engineers come on the stream, this is their sweat and sometimes tears of months of work that they've poured into something, right? As developers, you know what this feels like to work really, really hard on something. All developers are creators, all of us are. So given how hard it is for me to tell you about all of the features that there are every month, it's incredibly hard. I picked 3 that I thought were big milestones for VS Code from the past year. But there's so many other features we could have covered here. Each one deserves their own keynote. We have to scope it to something, so this is what they are. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about some of the bigger milestones and features from the last year-ish, starting with the 3-way merge editor, which had an interesting reception. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about floating editors or windows, which is the most requested VS Code feature of all time. Nothing else even really comes close. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is AI and GitHub Copilot. And I'm going to take you behind the scenes and give you a raw look at what that actually looks like in Visual Studio Code. So just over a year ago, we introduced a new merge editor experience in Visual Studio Code, and it's called a 3-way merge. Now, if you've never heard of a 3-way merge, then you're not alone. Neither had I until we actually released it. So what is it? This right here is the merge editor that you might be familiar with. It's what you see when you have a git merge conflict, which, let's face it, merge conflicts are one of the worst things about being a developer, right? It's just true. None of us like them. Nobody ever had a merge conflict. It was like, amazing. This is awesome. I love these. Right, because Git comes into your file and it drops text everywhere, these markers around your merge conflicts, then it just bails and you got a mess to clean up. And so VS Code gives you this merge editor experience to help you with the cleanup process here. So what's wrong with this? Well, there's nothing wrong with it if your merge conflict is a demo with a console log and 2 fake parameters. Right? But the real world is very complex, and a lot of times merges are very complex. And the reality is that this is not a merge editor at all. All this is some UI sugar, if you will, on top of the lines that that Git puts in your file when you have a merge conflict. But for dealing with complex merges, this experience here is just plainly put, completely inadequate. For something more complex merges, you need more than this, and what you need is something called a 3-way merge editor. So what is that? A three-way merge editor looks like this. In fact, this is the one that you'll find today in Visual Studio Code. Now, it's called a three-way merge because instead of just seeing the incoming and current changes right here, as we do, right, incoming and current, what we're seeing is the incoming, which are the changes that you're in conflict with on the left, your changes, which are on the right, and that column in the middle is what the branch looked like at the time that you forked it. It's kind of a trip. You're looking back in time because that's why the conflict occurs in the first place. It's not that your changes conflict with the other person's changes. It's that you're both trying to modify the same piece of history. And so what we see here is all three of these views, and that's why it's called a three-way merge editor. Now, down here at the bottom, what you're seeing is a result view, which allows you to build up the merge as you go so that it's kind of a preview. You know what it looks like before you actually commit back. Now, this looks more complex at first, right? If we're comparing sort of this merge editor experience to this merge editor experience, admittedly, this is more complex. But the reason for this is that most of us have never seen anything else besides the previous experience. And for a lot of us, we're unaware that this middle view even exists, right? We're just used to dealing with incoming and current. And so what happens then is because we don't know about that, we just sort of accept that merge conflicts are a nightmare, and that's just what it's like to be a developer. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's the thing. If you have a proper merge editor experience, it doesn't have to be that way. It can be a lot less painful. And as it turns out, as we were building this merge editor experience, we realized that we could actually take this a step further. So check this out. When you have a merge conflict, Git doesn't actually try and merge your changes. Or maybe it's better if we say it doesn't try very hard. Okay? Basically what it does is it sees that there's a conflict, and then it just drops that garbage, for lack of a better word, in your file to show you that there's a conflict there, right? But it doesn't try to merge your changes. And this is something that is very often doable. So we've added this button in the merge editor here, the three-way merge editor. It says accept combination. And what this does is it takes an algorithm that we've developed here on the team to combine your changes with the incoming changes. And this is almost always I say almost always, very often this is what you want. You don't want your changes or the other changes, you want some combination of the two. And we can actually resolve a lot of this for you with just the click of a button. And this algorithm is so useful that we actually did an entire live stream on this, where we got with the engineer who worked on this feature, this is Henning, and dove into the algorithm. So if you're a person who likes algorithms and you want to dive in complete with visualizations and learn how this algorithm actually works, this diff algorithm, I highly recommend going back and watching this live stream. It's a great watch. It's very technical, very in-depth. And so between the three-way merge editor and the new algorithm that we developed that can resolve a lot of these conflicts for you, it's just a far better experience for developers, right? Merge conflicts are not value-added time for you. You've already got the code working. You just need to get it back into source control. We just want to help you get it back there as quickly as possible. All of that time in between is just not value-add for you as a developer. So we shipped this as the new default merge editor experience. And this had been in the works for so long. We were so happy to be able to offer this, right? And to be able to resolve so many of these merge conflicts for you. And so the PM who had worked for so many months on this feature, a PM is a product manager here at Microsoft, took some much needed vacation and went on a rafting trip in Serbia. Okay, so completely disconnected from the internet and from technology, out in nature, on the rapids, enjoying some much needed time off, being refreshed. And as he's sitting around with his fellow trip companions, the guides, the other rafters in a remote part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, after a long day on the rapids, and they're getting to know each other and asking each other questions. And when it comes to him, and they ask him, what do you do? And he says, well, I work at Microsoft on it's a code editor. It's called Visual Studio Code. And two of his fellow companions, this is a true story, two of the fellow rafters out in the middle of nowhere said, oh yeah, Visual Studio Code. By the way, you just shipped a new merge editor experience and it's confusing. Could you please switch it back, right? So even out in the wilderness when you're trying to get away from work, sometimes you just can't. But it wasn't just these two fellows out on the rapids. It was other folks we were getting the feedback, can you please change it back? Can you please change it back? So what happened here, right? We built this much nicer merge experience. We even can resolve merge conflicts for you, but people wanted it to be changed back. So as it turns out, the three-way merge editor is very powerful, but it's just too jarring for a lot of people. This view here is all that a lot of people have ever known. They've never seen anything else, and when you change that, it can be quite disorienting. Also, if you're on a very small screen, that three-way merge editor is just really, really busy. And this is an ongoing battle for us with Visual Studio Code, right? It needs to be flexible enough to accommodate very complex workflows, but it needs to be simple enough that if you're a student or you're picking up coding for the first time, that you don't open the editor and just be immediately overwhelmed with the interface. But experienced devs and power users need to know that these features exist and aren't hidden behind some obscure menu or setting. It also needs to take advantage of all the real estate on your screen. Maybe you have one of those giant 42-inch monitors. Maybe you have 3 of them, right? And it also needs to work on a 13-inch laptop screen because a lot of folks are just using that. And it turns out that for Visual Studio Code, it's almost always better for us to start with the simplest experience possible and then let you opt into a more powerful one. So we swapped back to the editor experience that was previous, that you'll know today. You'll see this by default. But if you have a merge conflict and you haven't tried the three-way merge editor, I'd like to encourage you to click that Resolve in Merge Editor button and see how much better the experience can be. We don't want you to suffer out there with the merge conflicts unnecessarily. So give that a try, and then you can set this as the default in settings if you decide that you like it better. But not all features in Visual Studio Code are complex like this, right? Not all of them require us to develop a new UI and a custom algorithm, right? Some look complex, but in reality, they're actually quite simple. Floating windows is the #1 most requested feature of all time in Visual Studio Code. What is a floating window? A floating window is the ability to pull a tab out of VS Code and have it in a separate window, but still attached to the project that you have open. And if you've used other editors like Visual Studio, they've had this feature for a long time. Email programs have had this feature for a long time. So you're probably familiar with this behavior. If you have multiple monitors, this is especially useful and necessary, right, as you want to take different files and put them in different places. Okay. The first issue that I can find on this goes all the way back to August 4th of 2016. Just as a reminder, VS Code was released in 2015. This is shortly after that. And it is the most requested feature of all time, right? Nothing else is really even in earshot here. And in fact, it was so popular that at some point we actually had to lock this issue. Now, we do that from time to time, not because we're trying to lock you out of the issue, but if we feel like it's been sufficiently discussed, then we'll lock it to stop it from becoming exceptionally noisy, and so that people who are on the thread don't get bombarded with, I also need this kind of comments, which, I do myself. But when we lock it, you can still react there, as you can see at the top, and so we can gauge the ongoing popularity, and this thing was just always super popular. People were always asking for this. We released this. This is in VS Code today. So right now, if you have VS Code open, if you didn't know you can do this, grab a tab, drag it out of the editor, drop it, and you'll have a new window. Okay? November of 2023, which is just slightly more than 7 years to the date from the original issue. And so The question then is, well, why? Why 7 years if it was so popular from so early on? Was it just not a priority? What happened here? Multiple windows in an application is an inherently complex affair. When you have multiple windows, you're really talking about multiple processes that are trying to edit the same context, in this case, the same editor buffer. And whenever you're dealing with multiple processes in programming, it is messy, messy business. If you've done this before, then you're aware of how bad this can be. It can be done, right? And you might be thinking, but I've seen this before, right? You already said Visual Studio has it, my email program does it. What is the deal? Why is this so hard? Applications with multiple windows have been around for a very long time. This is true. And that's because the operating system handles this multi-process quagmire, if you will, for you when you're using a native application. But VS Code, if you didn't know, does not run as a native application per se. It runs in something called Electron. Electron is a shell around what's essentially a Chrome browser inside. So if you didn't know, Visual Studio Code is essentially HTML, CSS, and TypeScript running as a native app inside of this Electron shell. In fact, you can open the browser developer tools on Visual Studio Code. Try this right now. You can go to your command palette, look for developer tools, and you can literally open the developer tools on Visual Studio Code and inspect it like you would a web page. And to add even more complexity to this equation, there's also vscode.dev. So again, if you weren't aware, VS Code will run in the browser. You can open up any browser tab right now, type in vscode.dev, and you'll see VS Code loaded in your browser. And this is not some web version of VS Code. It is VS Code running in your browser. Now, you won't have access to your terminal because you're in a browser, but the point is that we're not giving you some trimmed down experience. This is Visual Studio Code. If you happen to see Eric Gamma's keynote from 3 years ago, he mentioned that the ethos of VS Code has always been a browser-based editor that feels native, and that's what you're using when you use it on the desktop. So whatever we do has to work on the web as well as on the desktop. So really, we only have access to what APIs are supported by Electron. Electron supports a lot of APIs, but not all Chrome APIs. And on top of that, we had experience building these multi-process products. So LiveShare is a great example, right? We had experience building LiveShare, and we had touched that stove, and it was very, very hot. So we were not super excited to touch it again for floating windows. And also, we felt like users had become really comfortable with VS Code's single window model. These are called editor groups. You might have seen this before, right? You can drag tabs out and arrange them in a variety of different layouts and grids. And they're very flexible, right? If you double click on a tab, the other windows will move to the side here to give you more focus. And we just recently added the ability to maximize one of these, right? And then if you repeat that action, it just completely restores your layout. So these are called editor groups. They're very, very powerful. And actually, you know, VS Code is a very flexible editor, and we've worked to make other things available as editors as well. So you can take, for instance, like a terminal, and you can move it into the editor. Or you could take a GitHub Copilot session, and you can move that into the editor space there, right? So you got a lot of options here. We've worked really hard to make VS Code flexible, and in fact, you can pretty much drag anything around in VS Code and configure it how you like. So you could try this. Like take the terminal and drag it to the sidebar, right? Or take the file explorer and drag it to the bottom panel. You can do this. And we put a lot of work into this flexibility instead of building, you know, this complex and cumbersome solution for multiple windows. But we never forgot about the floating window request, right? We knew that there had to be an elegant solution for this that would work both on the web and on the desktop, right? We never stopped thinking about this. We were thinking about it all the time. We knew a simpler solution was out there. We just didn't know how simple it would be. So about 2 years ago, we noticed that there were in fact other Electron apps that had support for multiple windows, most notably Slack and Teams. Now, we already knew that it was possible to open a new window with Electron, and Slack and Teams aren't necessarily code editors. You'll see here, like as I type in one window, it does show up in the other window, but not instantaneously. Or in other words, we don't know if they're editing the same processor, if they're just tied to the same API. Also, just as a note here, Teams does run on WebView 2 now, but at the time it was running in Electron. But the point is that we knew that other applications were doing this, right? And so Slack and Teams demonstrating multiple window Electron applications here. And around this same time, one of the engineers on the team was reading through the changelog of a new Chrome release and saw that there's an API now for picture-in-picture support, right? And YouTube leverages this. If you go to YouTube, right, and it puts a little player down at the bottom, that's what it's using, is this Chrome API for picture-in-picture support. And so they begin investigating this YouTube API as a possible solution for the multiple process problem. But in the process of exploring this API, even though it didn't pan out, one of our engineers tried something that had not yet been tried. So when you open a new tab in Chrome or Edge or many other browsers, a separate process is created, right? This is a screenshot here of my Edge browser and some of my tabs. And what you'll see here is that each browser is running in its own process. That's what happens when you open a new tab. And we do this so that one tab can't just crash the whole browser, hopefully. I know it still happens, right? It happens to me too. But the idea is that if we isolate these tabs into processes, multiple processes, that the browser becomes more stable and one tab can't cause the whole thing to go south. Now, when you open a new tab, you usually do that by clicking on a link or Control-T, or maybe there's a plus in the top of your browser. That's how you do it as a user interface. But as a developer, how do you open a new tab? If you're in Chrome and you're writing JavaScript to open a new tab, how do you do that? It's a one-liner, right? It's window.open. This is one of the oldest browser APIs. And it turns out that unlike tabs that are created when you click on the link or do Control-T or however you do it with your mouse, when you open a new window with window.open, Chrome does not, in fact, create a new process. It's still the same process as the parent window. Even though it looks like a full native window, it's actually not a separate process, which means that if you open a file in a parent window, and then you open the same file in a child window and edit in one place, the changes are just reflected automatically. It essentially negates the entire multi-process problem. All we needed to do to handle these multiple processes was call window.open. Now, you may be familiar with the saying, if it sounds too good to be true, like it probably is, or there's no such thing as a free lunch, kind of the same idea, right? And you become very skeptical about these things, right? Like nothing in life is this easy. This can't be the solution here. There's always a catch. What's the catch? Except there's no catch. The solution to what we consider to be one of the most complex problems, complex features to be delivered in Visual Studio Code was easily one of the simplest answers that we've seen on any problem. Now, there's more that goes into this, right? We're not just calling, we didn't just write window.open and then ship it and be like, there you go, multiple windows, right? Lunch isn't entirely free, right? There's engineering that goes on behind the scenes to take care of it, but it does take care of the core issue, which was the multiple processes concern. And the thing is, like, we could have built a solution for this back in 2016, right? We'd already done it with LiveShare. We knew how to, it's not like we didn't know how to do it. We knew how to do it. It's just that we knew that there was a simpler answer. And sometimes things can be so simple that they just kind of hide in plain sight, I guess. And so I guess talking to the engineer who worked on this, The moral of the story, like for us as developers, is that if you believe that something is inherently complex, you won't go looking for simple solutions, right? You'll just sort of move right past them and focus on the complex solutions. So when we launched this feature, we only supported code editors at launch. We only supported code editors, but we're adding support for different kinds of windows all the time. Like we believe we just added support for Markdown previews, so you can now have those as other editor windows as well. And we're working on delivering more, but in the meantime, because we add the flexibility of having really anything be an editor, such as your terminal, you can take your terminal, right, and you can promote it to be an editor, and then you can detach that and have your terminal running in its own separate window, but still tied to the project. You can do this with a Copilot chat as well. So some problems look complex, and they're complex, but some are just dead simple in the end, and the simplest answer, as Occam said, is usually the correct one. But some problems look complex, but in reality, they are way, way worse. Have you heard of GitHub Copilot? It's actually kind of hard to get away from the word Copilot these days, no matter where you go. A little bit impossible, right? So there's a Copilot for everything, it seems like, right? It's in Windows, it's in Office, it's on GitHub.com, it's in Edge. It's in Edge DevTools, by the way. If y'all didn't know this, open DevTools in Edge, and you'll see the Copilot icon in there that can help you diagnose console errors. Very cool. Check that out if you haven't seen that. Shout out to our friends here at Edge. So Copilot has become kind of like a Kleenex of AI, right? Like it's used interchangeably. I've even heard my wife say that, right? She'll call ChatGPT Copilot. But GitHub Copilot is the original Copilot. Okay, that's where the name comes from. It's also the most widely adopted AI developer tool in history. Programmers are in this incredibly unique spot where we get to reap the benefits of AI way before everybody else does. And this is because AI is powerful, but in a lot of cases, we're just not really sure what to do with it yet. What problem does it solve? But when it comes to coding, AI is just remarkably helpful. In fact, so much so that we're at this genuine inflection point in our industry where we're poised to make these incredible steps forward on top of the ones that we have already made. And in fact, GitHub Copilot was released in June of 2021. So what are we? We're almost 3 years now, I think, from that original release. It's a VS Code extension, and it powered AI code completions, right? This is also called Ghost Text. And at the time, it was running on the OpenAI model called Codex, although today it runs on a model called 3.5 Sahara instead of Codex. But this is what Ghost Text looks like, right? So you can write a comment, and then Copilot will sort of kick in here and will start writing code for you. He says, there we go. So it's going to remove occurrences here. And this works remarkably well. To this day, this is one of the most productive uses of Copilot, especially when, as you'll see, you don't even have to ask anymore at some point, right? Ghost Text can kind of look at the rest of your file, and as you type, write the code that you were going to write anyway without you even having to ask for it. This is incredibly powerful. The first time that this happens for you, it really is sort of altering, and you can see the potential of AI. And we truly believe in that potential. We do. We're fully bought into the promise that AI can deliver incredible productivity gains for you, right? That it can help you learn new things, that it can get you unstuck when you get stuck by those silly mistakes, that it can empower every developer on the planet to achieve more, which is the literal mission statement of Microsoft, by the way. But Ghost Text has its limits, okay? First off, it doesn't really have a dedicated interface, right? There's no way to really communicate with the AI outside of the code that you're writing, or comments is the way that we do it. So for a while, what we would do here is use certain tricks to get an interaction going with Copilot. you can still do this. This still works, by the way. So if you ask in like this Q&A format, you can ask technical questions like right here in comments like this. And this works, right? You can ask questions about Git, or you can ask questions about a specific language, and it will answer you. And even more so than that, it will do a lot of stuff. Like it can even complete song lyrics, right? It still does this. Or, it can do things like write jokes. You can still do this with Ghost Text. We made a lot of videos on this because it was a lot of fun to work with. But, oh, ouch. That hurts. Too close to home on that one. Sorry about that. But this interaction model was limited, right? It's not a real true interaction model. It's kind of us as users working around. And then in November of 2022, this happens, right? And you kind of know the rest of the story. ChatGPT becomes the fastest growing product in history. And it sent everybody scrambling to try to figure out how to put AI into their product. And we'd actually been working on Chat and Copilot for a while to enable this iterative interaction. And we did that in March of 2023, I believe. So Copilot Chat is a separate extension, although now bundled with GitHub Copilot. If you install one, then you automatically get the other. But the idea was never to just sort of recreate ChatGPT inside of VS Code, or it's maybe slightly more convenient to have it there and not in a separate window, but it's not really an improvement, right? ChatGPT, after all, is free, and GitHub Copilot is not free. So what are we paying for here? So the answer is always context. Models are only as good as the context that you give them, and the more accurate the context that you give them, the better the answer that you get. Copilot Chat knows about the text that you have selected. It knows about the code in what we call the viewable editor space. It knows about code in some of the other tabs that you have open. And so, in addition to knowing about the context, when you have chat in the sidebar, that's great, but you can also take the chat out and you can put it inside of the editor where a developer can actually iterate inline with chat. So here's an example of that. Inline chat is this very unique interaction. So while Ghost Text is powered by 3.5 Sahara, inline chat is powered by 3.5 or 4, depending on the interaction that you make with the AI. And we do that for speed, right? It has to be performant. If you're waiting a long time for answers, that's not helpful at all. And so inline chat's job is a very serious one. It's to write code in your editor. Now, when we do it in a blank file like this, no big deal, no problem, it's fine. But a lot of times, what we're doing as developers is we're highlighting a block of text and then opening inline chat and asking it to make some modification. And when you do that, the changes that you're asking for are often changes that need to occur at multiple places in the file. Maybe you need some code in that block, maybe you need some code below that block, and maybe you need an import statement at the top. And inline chat has to negotiate all of these changes because this is a very serious business, right? It's very easy for the AI to just mangle your file with a bad response. And so unlike Ghost Text, inline chat is working with a chat model and not completions, which means that when you get back an answer, you don't just get back code, you get back an actual answer, right? There's metadata along with the data that you're actually asking for. And so here's an example of what happens, right, when you say, I want a simple Express server, and then you get the data there, but you also get this intro, and then you get this outro at the end where it's trying to explain to you what it's just given you. Now, this is a very simple example, but it can be a lot worse than this. So you may be familiar with a term called prompt engineering. It's a very hot term right now. This is the process of writing prompts to get exactly what you want from the AI. It's one thing to do this as a developer, okay? But when you're trying to build a tool on top of AI, it's completely different. Prompt engineering sort of implies that we know the steps to get a specific result, but we don't, right? The reality is that it's a lot of trial and error at best to get to a prompt that performs really, really well. And so we're sort of entering into this new stage of programming that can really best be described as stochastic. Now, stochastic just means unpredictable, okay? It's kind of like the weather. We can predict the weather, but we may be wrong. We can't predict it for sure. We can just have some amount of confidence about it. And this is tough. Our systems are built on reliable output. What do you do when a system no longer has reliable output? So for instance, when you are using something like the fix command, which by the way is one of the most used commands in GitHub Copilot, this is what actually happens behind the scenes, okay? This is what we pass to the model. There could be multiple problems, so we pass all of the problems. Here there's just one. But then we see this code, right? We see the triple backticks, which if you've done prompt engineering classes before, you'll notice that the triple backticks is used often to delimit things in the model, in interactions with the model. So in this case, we have this code, then the code has the problem reported, and then the problem. So it's split up like that. And then look, there's a second user message, different from the first, that says, describe in a single sentence how you would solve the problem. After that sentence, add an empty line. And then add a code block with the fix. And then the problem is repeated in the second user interaction. This is not an accident, right? This prompt has been worked on and worked on and worked on to get the best possible result. And so what we get back from the model is this right here. And this is something that we can now parse out so that we can give you back this right here, which is this is a very simple example, right? It can get much more complex than this. So the problem then becomes that, as you can imagine, testing becomes difficult. In a normal scenario, you have tests, right? You make a change, and then maybe one of the tests fails, okay? So that means you have a regression. So you fix that regression, you run the test suite again, because you run the whole suite every time, and then now all the tests are passing, great. But when you're working with an AI, let's say we make a one-word change to fix a prompt, okay? One-word change to fix a prompt. And we run the whole test suite. And now these 3 tests are failing, okay? So we go look at these 3 tests. We can't see why they would be affected. So we'll run the test suite again, and now 3 other tests are failing. Why? Because the model is stochastic. It doesn't give you back the same result every time. How are we supposed to program like this? Right? This becomes so frustrating. It's very difficult. Classical testing just doesn't work here. And so we've developed something that we call a simulation test, which is like an end-to-end test, except for what we do is we simulate the user's interaction, but the tests, we actually expect that they will fail. And then what we do is we score them. And then as long as the score is at a certain point, then we consider that to be a passing test. And then we do some other things to cache and make sure that they don't change throughout the day, so we're at least working with something that resembles something that's usable and doesn't get super distracting. Because we've spent so much time working on these prompts, what we've kind of figured out is that the best prompt is the one that you as a developer don't have to write, okay? So an example of that would be ghost text. That's the most canonical example of this. The best prompt is the one that you don't have to write, where you're not really writing a prompt, you're just coding. And the AI comes alongside you and codes with you. Another example would be when we know about your Git changes and we can make a commit message and actually now an entire PR description for you as well. Again, there's no prompt for you to write there. The AI is just useful for you. Another one would be where we can suggest names for you, right? Because naming things is extremely difficult. Or even when you do the /fix, you're not actually writing a prompt here. We're writing the prompt for you so that you just have to write /fix. So if you're writing /fix and then, please fix this or something after, you don't need to do that. /fix is all you need to do. We will handle everything else. We've been dealing with this nightmare of prompts in the background so that you don't have to. And I kind of want to, if we go back to this raft on the river, right? This is what it kind of feels like to develop on AI. The water is rushing underneath us all, but we're trying to ship something, right? And so as you as a developer begin to work with AI, you may feel like this person standing on the edge of this raft, but we're there with you, right? And we promise to bring you the promise of AI through GitHub Copilot. You're not alone. We're going there with you. We're all going as developers, and we'll continue to deliver that for you with GitHub Copilot. I want to just give a special thanks to the following folks who helped out and provided the input on this keynote. They were very busy, so thanks to all those folks. Thank you for being with us here for VS Code Day. It's going to be a phenomenal day. We're so glad you're here, and as always, y'all, happy smart coding.